Case 1. Carmen Sue Brannon. A 29-year-old man was placed in a county jail cell on a possession charge. He had been there 1 week. He had a documented medical condition that required daily medication to keep him alive. That medication was available. That medication was sent to the jail by his own mother, and the registered nurse responsible for his care made a documented decision, according to court testimony, to do nothing. William Joel Dixon never left that cell alive. This is Case 1. The case of Carmen Sue Brannon, registered nurse, George County Regional Correctional Facility, Lucedale, Mississippi. The George County Regional Correctional Facility, known as GCRCF, is located in Lucedale, in the southeastern corner of Mississippi, in George County. It is a county detention facility that at the time of the events in this case housed between 350 and 400 inmates on any given day. Carmen Sue Brannon held the position of highest-ranking medical authority at that facility. As a registered nurse, she was the individual responsible for assessing inmate health, coordinating medical care, determining who needed physician referrals, and ensuring that inmates with documented chronic conditions received the treatment required to keep them stable. That responsibility was not informal. It was structural. In a correctional facility without an on-site physician, the nurse is the medical decision-maker by default. Every request for care, every complaint, every flag raised by corrections officers about an inmate's condition, it all passed through Brannon. Understanding that chain of authority is essential to understanding this case, because when the investigation began, every piece of evidence traced back to one decision point: Carmen Sue Brannon. William Joel Dixon was 29 years old when he was booked into the George County Regional Correctional Facility in September of 2014. He had been arrested on a charge of possession of a controlled substance and was awaiting the legal process while held in the facility. Dixon was a diabetic. That was not a hidden condition, not something the facility discovered after the fact. It was a known, documented medical diagnosis. Type 1 diabetes requires regular insulin administration to regulate blood sugar. Without that insulin, the body enters a state of diabetic crisis that, if left unaddressed, results in death. This is not a complicated or obscure medical fact. It is basic clinical knowledge that any registered nurse would have learned in the first year of nursing school. Dixon's family was aware of his condition and of his incarceration. His mother took action to ensure her son would have access to the medication he needed while in custody. According to testimony presented at trial, she sent insulin to the facility. That insulin arrived. It was documented. What happened next is what this case is built on. William Joel Dixon was 29 years old when he was booked into the George County Regional Correctional Facility in September of 2014. He had been arrested on a charge of possession of a controlled substance and was awaiting the legal process while held in the facility. Dixon was a diabetic. That was not a hidden condition, not something the facility discovered after the fact. It was a known, documented medical diagnosis. Type 1 diabetes requires regular insulin administration to regulate blood sugar. Without that insulin, the body enters a state of diabetic crisis that, if left unaddressed, results in death. This is not a complicated or obscure medical fact. It is basic clinical knowledge that any registered nurse would have learned in the first year of nursing school. Dixon's family was aware of his condition and of his incarceration. His mother took action to ensure her son would have access to the medication he needed while in custody. According to testimony presented at trial, she sent insulin to the facility. That insulin arrived. It was documented. What happened next is what this case is built on. In September of 2014, William Joel Dixon was found unresponsive in his cell at the George County Regional Correctional Facility. He had been in custody for approximately 1 week. Emergency protocols were initiated. Medical personnel responded. Dixon was pronounced dead. The cause of death was connected to his diabetic condition and the absence of the insulin management he required. He had been in a facility where insulin was present, where his condition was documented, where corrections officers had raised alarms, and where a registered nurse with full medical authority had been repeatedly notified. Following the discovery, an investigation was launched. Brannon was suspended from her position, pending the results of the investigation and the autopsy. She was subsequently terminated from her employment at the facility. The case was referred to the local district attorney's office for criminal review. The investigation into William Dixon's death involved multiple layers. The initial autopsy was conducted to establish the medical cause of death and to document the state of Dixon's health at the time of his passing. Investigators then turned to the facility's records. Documentation of medical requests, nurses' notes, logs of officer communications, and the chain of custody for the insulin that Dixon's mother had delivered to the facility. The records were critical. In a correctional setting, interactions between inmates and medical staff are supposed to be documented. Every assessment, every refusal of care, every note made by a nurse becomes part of the institutional record. Investigators combed through those records looking for what had been logged, and equally importantly, what had not been logged. The state later retained a nursing expert, Laurel Roscoe, to review the evidence and provide professional context. Roscoe's expert opinion, presented during trial, was that Brannon had been operating well beyond the acceptable scope of practice for a registered nurse by making unilateral decisions to withhold care without physician consultation or proper clinical justification. The correctional officers who had reported their concerns about Dixon were interviewed, and their accounts became part of the evidentiary record. Their testimony would prove central when the case went to trial. The case against Carmen Sue Brannon first went to trial in George County. The proceedings involved the presentation of the medical evidence, the testimony of correctional officers, the expert opinion of the nursing expert Laurel Roscoe, the testimony of Ulysses Williams, and the testimony of Dixon's mother regarding the insulin she had sent to the facility. The George County jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. According to reports, the vote stood at 11-1 in favor of conviction, but because jury verdicts in Mississippi criminal cases require unanimity, the trial resulted in a hung jury. The court declared a mistrial. That outcome, while not a conviction, was also not an exoneration. The case remained active, and the prosecution moved to retry Brannon. The first trial had taken place in January of 2018, nearly 3.5 years after Dixon's death, in September of 2014. The delay reflected the complexity of building a criminal case against a licensed medical professional in a correctional setting, a context in which medical decision-making is often subject to competing interpretations. The defense, throughout the proceedings, maintained that Brannon's judgments constituted a professional assessment rather than criminal neglect, a position that the prosecution directly challenged with expert testimony and the documented record of ignored warnings. Following the mistrial in George County, a change of venue was granted, and the second trial was moved to Warren County, Mississippi. Changes of venue in high-profile cases serve the interest of ensuring an impartial jury pool, and in this case, the court determined that the move was appropriate given the nature of the case and the community in which the facility operated. The second trial took place before Judge Richard W. McKenzie. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Anthony Lawrence, known as Tony Lawrence, and Assistant District Attorney Cherie Wade. The same body of evidence that had been presented in the first trial was brought before the Warren County jury, along with the same witnesses, the correctional officers, the nursing expert Lori Roscoe, co-worker nurse Ulysses Williams, and Dixon's mother. The 5-day trial gave both sides the opportunity to present their cases fully. The defense continued to argue that Brannon's conduct represented a professional judgment call, not criminal conduct. The prosecution argued that the evidence established a pattern of deliberate inaction in the face of documented warnings and a known medical condition. On July 30, 2018, the Warren County jury returned a verdict of guilty on a charge of manslaughter. The manslaughter conviction against Carmen Sue Brannon was entered under Mississippi's misdemeanor manslaughter statute, in a provision applicable to cases in which a death results from a failure to provide sufficient medical attention to an inmate. This statutory framework acknowledged the specific duty of care that exists in a correctional medical context. Brannon was sentenced to 15 years in the custody of the Mississippi Department of Corrections. Following sentencing, her defense attorney, Mary Lee Holmes, sought and was granted a $200,000 appeal bond on August 16, 2018, allowing Brannon to remain free while pursuing her appeal. Holmes publicly stated that an overworked jail nurse responsible for between 350 and 400 inmates had been sentenced to 15 years in prison for what she characterized as a medical malpractice incident involving the misevaluation of an inmate. The defense's framing consistently held that the case represented the criminalization of a difficult professional environment rather than intentional wrongdoing. The prosecution and the jury saw the evidence differently. The appeal of Brannon's conviction was heard by the Mississippi Court of Appeals, which issued its decision on October 20, 2020, more than 2 years after the conviction at the second trial. The Court of Appeals reviewed the sufficiency of the evidence, the legal instructions given to the jury, and the various arguments raised by the defense. In its written opinion, filed under case number 2018 KA01203, COA, presiding Judge Wilson authored the court's findings. The court's written opinion included the following. This evidence is sufficient for the jury to have found that Brannon made a deliberate decision not to provide sufficient medical attention to Dixon. The Mississippi Court of Appeals affirmed the conviction in full. Following the Court of Appeals ruling, Brannon's attorneys sought further review from the Mississippi Supreme Court, the highest court in the state. On June 18, 2021, the Mississippi Supreme Court declined to review the case, leaving the Court of Appeals decision in place and the conviction standing. Brannon began serving her sentence in October of 2020. Parallel to the criminal proceedings, the family of William Joel Dixon pursued civil legal action against the parties they held responsible for his death. A federal wrongful death lawsuit was filed, naming George County, the city of Lucedale, and Brannon as defendants. The civil case moved through the federal court system over several years and ultimately resulted in a settlement. On May 31, 2022, the settlement in the amount of $2,750,000 was approved. The civil settlement did not constitute an admission of liability by any of the named parties, but its value represented a significant acknowledgment of the loss suffered by the Dixon family and of the legal exposure that existed in connection with the circumstances of Dixon's death. For the family of William Joel Dixon, the civil settlement closed one chapter. The criminal conviction, affirmed through the full appellate process to the Mississippi Supreme Court, had already closed another. The Brannon case drew attention to a persistent and documented challenge in American criminal justice: the provision of adequate medical care in county jail and correctional facilities. Unlike state prisons, which typically operate under more structured oversight frameworks, county jails often function with minimal medical staff, sometimes a single nurse covering hundreds of inmates. The legal standard for inmate medical care was established by the United States Supreme Court in Estelle v. Gamble, a 1976 decision that held that deliberate indifference to the serious medical needs of a prisoner constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. That standard, deliberate indifference, is precisely the framework through which the criminal case against Brannon was evaluated, even under the state misdemeanor manslaughter statute. What the Dixon case illustrated was the consequences when that standard is not met and when oversight mechanisms fail to catch the failure in real time. The correctional officers who flagged Dixon's condition did what they could within their roles. The system, through its reliance on a single nurse as the sole medical authority, created a situation in which one person's decision or one person's failure to act could determine whether an inmate lived or died. William Joel Dixon had been in custody for 1 week. He was 29 years old. He had insulin sent by his mother. He had officers raising alarms. And none of it was enough to save his life. Defendant: Carmen Sue Brannon, registered nurse. Facility: George County Regional Correctional Facility, Lucedale, Mississippi. Victim: William Joel Dixon, age 29. Offense: manslaughter. Failure to provide sufficient medical attention to an inmate. Conviction date: July 30th, 2018. Warren County Circuit Court. Sentence: 15 years, Mississippi Department of Corrections. Appeals: conviction affirmed by Mississippi Court of Appeals, October 20th, 2020. Mississippi Supreme Court denied review, June 18th, 2021. Civil outcome: federal wrongful death settlement of $2,750,000, approved May 31st, 2022. Case 2. April Renee Grissom. A 77-year-old cancer patient was in the ICU at a regional medical center. He had undergone 2 operations. He was connected to multiple life-sustaining machines. And according to a grand jury indictment, a registered nurse entered his care space and, without any physician's order, altered the equipment keeping him alive. Louis Betts Jr. died that same day. This is Case 2. The case of April Renee Grissom, registered nurse, Wesley Medical Center, Hattiesburg, Mississippi. This case ended in acquittal. We include it here because it is fully documented, because it went to trial, and because it illustrates the legal and evidentiary complexity involved when prosecutors charge a nurse with criminal homicide in an ICU setting. Wesley Medical Center is a regional hospital located in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, in Forest County. It serves a broad patient population across the Pine Belt region of the state and operates an intensive care unit that handles critically ill patients requiring advanced intervention. Louis Betts Jr. was 77 years old at the time of his admission to Wesley Medical Center. He had been diagnosed with colon cancer and had undergone 2 surgical procedures related to that diagnosis. Following those operations, Betts developed post-operative complications, including renal failure, a condition in which the kidneys are no longer able to adequately filter waste from the blood. Renal failure in a post-surgical cancer patient is a life-threatening complication that requires aggressive medical management. Betts was placed on dialysis to perform the kidney function his body could no longer manage on its own. He was also receiving amiodarone, a medication used to regulate heart rhythm, administered via an intravenous drip. Additionally, he was receiving vasopressors, specifically norepinephrine and phenylephrine, intravenous medications used to maintain blood pressure in critically ill patients. Each of these interventions represented a component of the medical framework keeping Louis Betts Jr. alive. The combination of the dialysis machine and the medication drips constituted his life support system. April Renee Grissom was a registered nurse assigned to Louis Betts Jr.'s care. According to the indictment returned by a Lamar County grand jury, and consistent with the announcement made by then Attorney General Jim Hood, April Renee Grissom allegedly took a series of actions in connection with the equipment and medications supporting Louis Betts Jr. The indictment alleged that Grissom, without any documented physician's order authorizing the changes, turned off the dialysis machine that was managing Betts's renal failure. The indictment further alleged that she turned off the amiodarone drip that was regulating his heart rhythm. Additionally, the indictment alleged that she decreased, that is, reduced the rate of both the norepinephrine and the phenylephrine drips, the vasopressors maintaining his blood pressure. The charge brought against Grissom was second-degree murder under the Mississippi statute addressing what is commonly referred to as depraved heart murder, a charge applicable when a death results from conduct demonstrating a reckless disregard for human life, even without a specific intent to kill. Louis Betts Jr. died on March 26, 2013. Attorney General Hood, in announcing the indictment, stated that Grissom was accused of turning off the machines which were helping keep the alleged victim alive. The investigation into the death of Louis Betts Jr. was conducted by the Mississippi Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit rather than by local law enforcement. The involvement of the MFCU reflected the jurisdiction of that unit over potential crimes occurring in healthcare facilities that participate in the Medicaid program. The investigation involved a review of the clinical records from Wesley Medical Center for the period surrounding Betts's death. Medical records in an ICU setting are typically extensive and time-stamped, with nursing entries documenting assessments, medication administration, equipment checks, and any changes to a patient's care plan. Investigators reviewed those records to reconstruct the sequence of events. The review of records established the absence of any physician's order authorizing the changes to Betts's equipment and medications that were alleged in the indictment. In a clinical setting, nurses operate under physician orders for significant changes to a critically ill patient's care plan. The absence of such orders for the changes that allegedly occurred was central to the prosecution's theory of the case. Following the completion of the investigation, the matter was presented to a Lamar County grand jury. The grand jury returned an indictment against Grissom, and the case proceeded toward trial. Following the return of the grand jury indictment, April Renee Grissom, a resident of Petal, Mississippi, turned herself in to authorities. She was booked into the Lamar County Adult Detention Center. Her bond was set at $10,000. Grissom's arrest attracted regional media attention because of the unusual nature of the charge. A registered nurse being charged with second-degree murder for actions allegedly taken in the course of patient care. Criminal charges against nurses in ICU settings are rare, and the case prompted discussion within the healthcare community about the line between criminal conduct and clinical decision-making in end-of-life situations. The case was assigned in Lamar County Circuit Court. Both the prosecution and the defense began the process of preparing for trial, which would involve not only the documentary evidence from Wesley Medical Center, but also competing medical expert opinions about the clinical state of Louis Betts Jr. at the time of his death. The trial of April Renee Grissom began in 2016. It was a 4-day proceeding in Lamar County Circuit Court. The prosecution presented its case, built around the allegation that Grissom had made unauthorized changes to Betts's life-sustaining equipment and medications, and that those changes had caused or accelerated his death. The evidentiary record included the clinical documentation from Wesley Medical Center, the absence of physician orders for the changes alleged, and testimony regarding the standard of nursing care in an ICU setting. The defense introduced competing medical testimony. The defense called Dr. Stephen Stogner as an expert witness. Dr. Stogner's testimony addressed the clinical condition of Louis Betts Jr. at the time of his death. Dr. Stogner testified that, in his medical opinion, Betts had already been clinically in a fatal state from toxic shock by the time the events alleged in the indictment had occurred. His testimony challenged the prosecution's theory of causation, specifically the argument that any actions taken by Grissom had caused Betts's death, as opposed to Betts having died from the underlying severity of his medical condition. The competing expert testimony placed before the jury a central question. Was Louis Betts Jr.'s death caused by what the nurse allegedly did, or was it the inevitable result of the critical illness from which he was already suffering? After 4 days of testimony and deliberation, the jury in the trial of April Renee Grissom returned a verdict of not guilty. Grissom was acquitted on the second-degree murder charge. The acquittal reflected the jury's determination that the prosecution had not met its burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Whether that determination was driven by the competing medical testimony regarding causation, by the specific elements of the depraved heart murder charge, or by other factors considered during deliberations, the outcome was a complete legal exoneration for Grissom. This is an important fact that must be stated clearly and directly. April Renee Grissom was found not guilty. She is not a convicted criminal. The legal process ran its full course, and a jury concluded that the evidence was insufficient to support a criminal conviction. We include the Grissom case in this documentary for reasons that are specific and substantive. First, it is a fully documented case, anchored in a grand jury indictment, a formal prosecution by the Mississippi Attorney General's office, and a trial before a jury of 12. The allegations are part of the public record. Second, it illustrates the evidentiary complexity of prosecuting nurses for criminal conduct in critical care settings. The defense in this case was built on the argument that the patient was already dying, and that argument, presented through qualified medical expert testimony, was sufficient to raise reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. Third, and perhaps most importantly for the documentary purpose, the Grissom case is a counterexample. Not every allegation results in a conviction. Not every indictment is followed by a guilty verdict. The criminal justice system, when operating as intended, requires the prosecution to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. In this case, the jury determined that standard was not met. The families of patients in critical care settings, the hospitals that employ nurses, the state agencies that regulate health care, and the prosecutors who evaluate potential criminal charges in medical settings can all look at the Grissom case as a data point in understanding where the line between criminal conduct and medical judgment may, or may not, exist. Defendant, April Renee Grissom, registered nurse, Petal, Mississippi. Facility, Wesley Medical Center, Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Victim, Louis Betts, Jr., age 77. Charge, second-degree depraved heart murder. Investigating agency, Mississippi Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. Grand Jury, Lamar County. Trial, 2016, Lamar County Circuit Court, 4 days. Verdict, not guilty. Status, acquitted, no conviction. Case 3, Cheryl Renee Hamblett. Patients in a nursing home in Eupora, Mississippi, were prescribed controlled substances to manage their pain and medical conditions. Those prescriptions were filled, documented, and dispensed. But the medications were not reaching the patients they were prescribed for. A licensed practical nurse working inside the facility was taking them. This is Case 3, the case of Cheryl Renee Hamblett, licensed practical nurse, a nursing home in Eupora, Mississippi. The nursing home in which this case unfolded was located in Eupora, the county seat of Webster County, in north-central Mississippi. Webster County is a rural community, and the nursing home facility served elderly residents requiring skilled nursing care, assisted living support, and ongoing medical management. Cheryl Renee Hamblett was a licensed practical nurse, an LPN, employed at that facility. LPNs in Mississippi are licensed through the Mississippi Board of Nursing and operate under a defined scope of practice that includes medication administration, patient monitoring, and clinical support functions under the supervision of registered nurses and physicians. The administration of controlled substances in a nursing home setting is governed by a detailed regulatory framework. Controlled substances, medications classified under federal and state law based on their potential for abuse and dependence, must be dispensed, documented, administered, and accounted for under strict protocols. Every dose administered to a patient must be recorded. Every discrepancy between what was dispensed and what was administered must be investigated. Those protocols exist precisely because controlled substances in a healthcare setting represent both a therapeutic resource and a potential target for diversion, the taking of medications intended for patients for purposes other than patient care. According to the charging documents and the subsequent court proceedings, Cheryl Renee Hamblett diverted controlled substances from the nursing home in Eupora on 3 separate documented occasions. The substances involved were Percocet and hydrocodone, both Schedule II controlled substances under federal and Mississippi law. Schedule II is the classification reserved for drugs with the highest accepted medical use but also the highest potential for severe psychological or physical dependence. Percocet is an opioid pain medication combining oxycodone and acetaminophen. Hydrocodone is an opioid also used for pain management. Both medications were prescribed to patients at the facility. The diversion by Hamblett meant that those patients, elderly nursing home residents with documented medical needs, were not receiving the medications prescribed for them. In a nursing home population, untreated pain is not a minor matter. The individuals living in these facilities are often in the final chapters of their lives, managing chronic conditions, recovering from surgeries, or coping with progressive illnesses. Their prescribed medications are calibrated to their specific needs. In addition to the controlled substance charges, Hamblett was also charged with Medicaid fraud. The Medicaid fraud charge reflected the fact that the nursing facility billed Medicaid for medications that were documented as being administered to patients, medications that, in reality, Hamblett had taken for herself. Controlled substance diversion in healthcare settings is detected through a combination of methods, and the investigation into Hamblett's conduct followed procedures consistent with those used by the Mississippi Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit in similar cases. Medication diversion in nursing facilities typically comes to light through one or more of the following pathways: discrepancies in Pyxis, or similar automated medication dispensing systems, patient complaints about inadequate pain management, pattern analysis of waste and administration records, tips from coworkers, or audits triggered by Medicaid billing reviews. In the Hamblett case, the investigation was conducted by, or in coordination with, the Mississippi Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. That unit has jurisdiction over fraud, abuse, and patient harm occurring in facilities that participate in the Medicaid program. And nursing homes serving elderly residents frequently receive Medicaid reimbursement. The investigation documented 3 separate occasions on which Hamblett diverted controlled substances, a finding that established a pattern rather than an isolated incident. That pattern was significant for both the criminal charges and the sentencing proceedings that followed. The Medicaid fraud component of the investigation traced the billing records through which the facility had sought reimbursement for medications that had not been provided to patients, linking the diversion to a financial crime against the state's Medicaid program. The case against Cheryl Renee Hamblett proceeded through the circuit court system in Choctaw County, Mississippi. Rather than proceeding to trial, Hamblett entered a plea of guilty to the charges against her. The guilty plea was entered in Choctaw County Circuit Court before Judge Joseph Loper. The case was prosecuted by the Mississippi Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, which, in announcing the resolution of the case, issued a statement through then-Attorney General Jim Hood. In his statement, Attorney General Hood said his office was deeply committed to protecting the state's most vulnerable residents. That framing placed the Hamblett case within the broader mission of the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, not simply as a law enforcement exercise against a healthcare worker who committed financial fraud, but as a prosecution aimed at safeguarding the welfare of elderly and vulnerable individuals who depend on nursing home staff for their most basic needs. The guilty plea acknowledged the diversion of controlled substances on 3 separate occasions and the associated Medicaid fraud. Judge Joseph Loper sentenced Cheryl Renee Hamblett in Choctaw County Circuit Court. The sentence imposed on June 20th was 3 years on each count, with the sentences running concurrently, meaning simultaneously rather than consecutively. Of the 3-year sentence, 1 year was to be served in actual custody, with the remaining 2 years constituting post-release supervision. Post-release supervision in Mississippi operates similarly to probation, with conditions that typically include regular reporting to a supervision officer, restrictions on employment and travel, drug testing requirements, and compliance with any restitution orders. The concurrent structure of the sentence meant that Hamblett faced a practical custody term of 1 year, followed by supervised release. Cases of controlled substance diversion in nursing home settings carry consequences that extend beyond the immediate legal resolution. The patients from whom medications were diverted received less than the care they were entitled to, and for which their families and the Medicaid program paid. In the context of an elderly nursing home population, the withholding of pain management medication, even for a brief period, can have significant clinical consequences. Unmanaged pain affects sleep, mobility, mood, appetite, and the overall quality of daily life. For patients in the final stages of illness, Adequate pain management is not a luxury. It is a fundamental component of dignified care. The Hamblett case is one of multiple documented cases of controlled substance diversion from Mississippi care facilities. The pattern, seen across cases in this documentary, reflects the vulnerability of nursing home residents as a patient population and the critical importance of the oversight frameworks, medication reconciliation, waste documentation, dispensing system audits, and Medicaid billing reviews, designed to catch diversion before it continues over extended periods. A felony conviction for conduct related to the practice of nursing in Mississippi triggers scrutiny from the Mississippi Board of Nursing under the authority provided by Mississippi Code Annotated Section 73-1529. That provision gives the board grounds to revoke or suspend a nursing license upon conviction of a felony. The specific disciplinary action taken by the Mississippi Board of Nursing against Cheryl Renee Hamblett's LPN license was not confirmed in the sources available for this documentary. However, the combination of a felony guilty plea, a conviction for conduct directly related to the misuse of medications in a patient care context, and the resulting criminal sentence would ordinarily place her license before the board for review. For a licensed practical nurse, the loss of licensure represents the permanent removal from the regulated healthcare workforce, a consequence that, alongside the criminal sentence, reflects the totality of professional accountability attached to the violation of the controlled substance standards governing nursing practice. Defendant Cheryl Renee Hamblett, licensed practical nurse, Houston, Mississippi. Facility, nursing home, Eupora, Mississippi. Offense, diversion of Schedule II controlled substances, Percocet and hydrocodone, on 3 occasions. Medicaid fraud, plea, guilty. Sentencing court, Choctaw County Circuit Court, Judge Joseph Loper. Sentence, 3 years on each count, concurrent, 1 year to serve, 2 years post-release supervision. Investigating agency, Mississippi Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. Case 4, Stephanie Cook. A patient at a Mississippi nursing home had been prescribed Norco, a Schedule II controlled substance containing hydrocodone, for a legitimate medical need. That prescription was documented. That medication was dispensed, but according to the indictment, the medication went to a nurse, not to the patient. This is Case 4. The case of Stephanie Cook, nurse, Covington County Nursing Center, Collins, Mississippi. The Covington County Nursing Center is located in Collins, the county seat of Covington County in south-central Mississippi. It is a skilled nursing facility, providing care to elderly and medically dependent residents who require assistance with daily living and ongoing healthcare management. Stephanie Cook was employed as a nurse at the Covington County Nursing Center. Her role placed her in direct contact with the patients at the facility and gave her access to the medications those patients were prescribed as part of their care plans. The regulatory framework governing controlled substances in nursing home settings in Mississippi requires that all Schedule II medications, opioids, stimulants, and other high-risk controlled substances be tracked from the point of dispensing through administration. Each dose must be documented. Waste, medication that is prepared but not administered, must be witnessed and recorded. These controls exist because Schedule II substances carry significant potential for abuse, and because their diversion from patients represents both a patient care failure and a criminal act. Norco, the medication at the center of this case, combines hydrocodone, an opioid, with acetaminophen. It is used for moderate to moderately severe pain management. As a Schedule II controlled substance, it is subject to the full weight of the controlled substance tracking requirements that apply to opioids in healthcare settings. The grand jury in Covington County indicted Stephanie Cook on 2 counts. The first count was Medicaid fraud. This charge addressed the financial dimension of the alleged conduct, specifically that the nursing facility had billed Mississippi's Medicaid program for the administration of Norco to a patient, when in fact, the medication had not been provided to that patient. The second count was obtaining possession of a controlled substance by fraud, misrepresentation, or subterfuge. This charge addressed the means by which Cook allegedly obtained the Norco, not through a prescription issued to her as a patient, but through the exploitation of her access and authority as a nurse within the facility to redirect a patient's medication to herself. Together, the 2 charges established both the patient harm dimension, the diversion of a medication away from a patient who needed it, and the financial crime dimension, the fraudulent billing of Medicaid for a service not rendered. If convicted on both counts, Cook faced a maximum of 10 years in prison and $2,000 in fines. The investigation of Stephanie Cook followed investigative pathways consistent with those used in controlled substance diversion cases in Mississippi's care facilities. The Mississippi Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit handled the investigation, and the case was announced by then-Attorney General Jim Hood. Medicaid fraud control units are specialized investigative bodies that combine law enforcement authority with healthcare program expertise. They have the capacity to review Medicaid billing records, pharmacy dispensing data, clinical documentation, and nursing home records simultaneously, building a picture of what was billed versus what was actually administered. In a case of this type, investigators typically begin with a billing discrepancy, a record showing that a medication was billed as administered on a particular date, followed by a review of the nursing notes, medication administration records, and dispensing logs for that same date. When those records do not align, when the billing says the medication was given, but the administration record does not support that conclusion, or when the dispensing log shows the medication was removed, but the patient's chart shows no administration, that discrepancy becomes the foundation of the investigation. The investigation then moves to identifying who had access to the medication on the relevant dates and who was responsible for the documentation. In nursing home settings, where staff assignments are recorded and shift logs are maintained, narrowing the field of potential suspects is typically a structured process. Following the completion of the Attorney General's investigation, the case against Stephanie Cook was presented to a Covington County grand jury. A grand jury in Mississippi, composed of citizens of the county, reviews the evidence presented by the prosecution and determines whether there is probable cause to issue a formal indictment charging the defendant with a crime. The Covington County grand jury returned an indictment against Cook on the 2 counts described above. Following the return of the indictment, Cook was arrested. The arrest was announced publicly by the Attorney General's office as part of the office's ongoing effort to prosecute healthcare workers who commit crimes against vulnerable patients in care settings. The announcement by Attorney General Hood connected the Cook case to the broader mission of protecting Mississippi's nursing home population, a population that, by virtue of age, disability, or medical dependency, is unable to advocate for itself or independently verify whether the care they are receiving is appropriate and complete. The case was proceeding through the Covington County court system at the arrest and indictment stage as documented in available records. Final disposition information for this case was not confirmed in the sources reviewed and should be verified through the Covington County Circuit Clerk's records before scripting a final outcome for documentary purposes. The Stephanie Cook case fits within a well-documented national and statewide pattern of controlled substance diversion by healthcare workers in nursing home and long-term care settings. This pattern reflects both the opportunity created by the healthcare workers' access to medications and the vulnerability of the patient population. In nursing homes, the patients who are prescribed opioids like Norco are typically individuals managing significant pain from conditions such as cancer, arthritis, post-surgical recovery, or other chronic conditions. These are patients who cannot easily communicate whether their pain is being managed, who may not recognize the signs of undertreated pain, and who depend entirely on the nursing staff to administer what they have been prescribed. When a nurse diverts those medications, the patient experiences unmanaged pain. In many cases, because the nurse documents the medication as administered, the prescribing physician receives no signal that the patient's pain management is inadequate. The patient's reported pain level, if they are able to report it at all, may be attributed to other factors rather than to the failure of the medication to be administered. This dynamic makes controlled substance diversion in nursing homes particularly difficult to detect without systematic auditing and particularly harmful to the patients involved. The Mississippi Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit is the primary investigative body for crimes of this type in Mississippi. Every state in the United States is required by federal law to operate a Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, and those units receive a combination of federal and state funding to support their operations. The MFCU has authority to investigate and prosecute fraud in the Medicaid program, which includes billing for services not rendered, such as the Medicaid fraud charge in the Cook case, as well as patient abuse, neglect, and exploitation occurring in Medicaid-certified facilities. The unit employs investigators with backgrounds in law enforcement, auditors with expertise in healthcare billing, and attorneys who prosecute the cases developed by the investigative team. The combination of financial auditing expertise and criminal investigative capacity allows the MFCU to pursue cases that require both an understanding of healthcare billing codes and the ability to build a criminal case for presentation to a grand jury and a trial jury. Defendant, Stephanie Cook. Nurse, Collins, Mississippi. Facility, Covington County Nursing Center, Collins, Mississippi. Charges, Medicaid fraud, obtaining possession of a controlled substance by fraud, misrepresentation, or subterfuge. Investigating agency, Mississippi Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. Grand jury, Covington County. Maximum exposure at indictment, 10 years and $2,000 in fines. Status, indicted and arrested. Final disposition to be verified via Covington County Circuit Clerk. Case 5, Leslie Wilborn. Over a period of 3 years, more than 146 prescriptions for a controlled sleeping medication were written in the names of family members and friends. Each prescription was picked up, not by the people named on them, but by the nurse practitioner who wrote them. And according to investigators with the Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics, that nurse practitioner was using those medications herself. This is Case 5, the case of Leslie Wilborn, nurse practitioner, Maxim Health Urgent Care, Gulfport and Pascagoula, Mississippi. Leslie Wilborn held a license as a nurse practitioner in Mississippi. Nurse practitioners are advanced practice registered nurses who hold graduate-level clinical training and in Mississippi have authority to diagnose, treat, and prescribe within a defined scope of practice. A nurse practitioner working in an urgent care setting has the authority to write prescriptions for a range of medications, including controlled substances within the applicable federal and state regulatory frameworks. Wilborn practiced at Maxim Health Urgent Care locations in both Gulfport, in Harrison County on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and Pascagoula in Jackson County. The Gulf Coast region of Mississippi is a densely populated area that experienced significant healthcare infrastructure development following Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and urgent care facilities serving that population include a wide range of providers. The prescription authority held by nurse practitioners is among the most significant trust-based responsibilities in the healthcare system. Patients who visit an urgent care facility and receive a prescription from a nurse practitioner are relying on that provider to make legitimate clinical determinations about their medical needs and to prescribe only what is medically necessary and appropriate. The controlled substance at the center of the Wilborn case was Ambien, the brand name for Zolpidem, a sedative hypnotic medication prescribed for the treatment of insomnia. Ambien is classified as a Schedule IV controlled substance under federal law, meaning it has an accepted medical use and a lower potential for abuse relative to Schedule II opioids. But it is still subject to regulatory controls because of its potential for dependence and misuse. In a clinical setting, Ambien prescriptions are written for specific patients based on a documented assessment of their sleep disorder. The prescribing provider is expected to evaluate the patient, document a diagnosis, and issue a prescription tailored to the patient's needs. What investigators alleged in the Wilborn case was that none of that legitimate clinical process occurred for the prescriptions in question. Instead, according to the investigation, Wilborn wrote prescriptions for Ambien in the names of her adult children, her mother, her father, and various friends, not because those individuals had been clinically assessed and determined to need Zolpidem, but as a mechanism for Wilborn to obtain the medication for herself. The scale of the conduct alleged against Wilborn is significant and warrants careful attention. According to information provided by investigators following her arrest, Wilborn had obtained more than 146 prescriptions of Ambien over a period of approximately 3 years. Each of those prescriptions contained 30 dosage units of the 10 milligram tablet. 30 units per prescription, multiplied by 146 prescriptions, represents a total of 4,380 individual dosage units of Ambien, all allegedly obtained through prescriptions written in other people's names and picked up by Wilborn for her own use. The 3-year time frame over which this conduct allegedly continued is also significant. Prescription drug monitoring programs, known as PDMPs, exist in Mississippi and in all other states as a tool for identifying patterns of controlled substance prescribing and dispensing that may indicate abuse or diversion. PDMPs maintain records of every controlled substance prescription dispensed in the state, accessible to prescribers, dispensers, and law enforcement investigators. The investigation by agents of the Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics would have involved a review of Wilborn's PDMP records, showing the full history of the Ambien prescriptions, who they were written for, when they were dispensed, and at which pharmacies they were filled. The investigation into Wilborn's conduct was initiated following a complaint. The Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics, the state's primary drug law enforcement agency, handled the investigation. Bureau of Narcotics agents investigating prescription fraud cases of this type typically employ a multi-step process. The initial complaint triggers a review of prescription monitoring program data, which provides a picture of prescribing and dispensing activity over time. Investigators then cross-reference that data with pharmacy records, patient records at the clinics where the defendant practiced, and insurance billing data. In the Wilborn case, agents reviewed the prescriptions attributed to her name as the prescriber and compared those records with the dispensing logs at the pharmacies where the prescriptions were filled. That comparison would have established who actually picked up the medications, a fact documented by pharmacies, which typically require identification from the person picking up a controlled substance prescription. The pattern that emerged from that review was the basis for the criminal charges. Prescriptions written in the names of family members and friends, dispensed at pharmacies, and picked up by Wilborn. Leslie Wilborn was arrested on July 8, 2021. She was charged with obtaining a controlled substance by fraud, misrepresentation, or subterfuge, the same legal framework applied to Stephanie Cook in the previous case, reflecting the consistent application of Mississippi's controlled substance statutes to healthcare workers who misuse their prescription authority for personal gain. Wilborn was booked into the Harrison County Adult Detention Center following her arrest. Harrison County, where Gulfport is located, was the site of her booking. The arrest was announced and reported by local news outlets on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, including WJTV, which noted that Wilborn was a nurse practitioner practicing at Maxim Health Urgent Care in Gulfport and Pascagoula. The charge she faced carried potential criminal penalties consistent with Mississippi's controlled substance statutes governing fraud and misrepresentation in the acquisition of controlled substances. The Wilborn case highlights the regulatory accountability that applies specifically to advanced practice registered nurses who hold prescribing authority. Nurse practitioners in Mississippi must hold a controlled substance registration in addition to their nursing license in order to prescribe Schedule II through Schedule V controlled substances. A conviction, or in some cases merely an indictment, for conduct related to the fraudulent use of prescribing authority can trigger both Federal Drug Enforcement Administration action on the prescriber's DEA registration and Mississippi Board of Nursing disciplinary proceedings affecting the nursing license. The DEA number associated with a nurse practitioner's controlled substance registration is a federally issued credential. Any conviction or adverse finding related to the misuse of that credential can result in the revocation of the DEA registration, effectively stripping the practitioner of the ability to prescribe controlled substances regardless of the status of the state nursing license. The Mississippi Board of Nursing has the authority to impose disciplinary action up to and including license revocation based on the same conduct that forms the basis of the criminal charges. The Wilborn case is instructive regarding the role of prescription drug monitoring programs in identifying and investigating controlled substance fraud. PDMPs are electronic databases that capture data from pharmacies every time a controlled substance prescription is filled. That data includes the patient's name, the prescriber's name, the DEA registration number of the prescriber, the date of dispensing, the quantity dispensed, and the pharmacy where the prescription was filled. Law enforcement agencies with appropriate authorization, including the Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics, can access PDMP data as part of investigations. The PDMP data provides a comprehensive picture of prescribing patterns over time, allowing investigators to identify anomalies, such as a single prescriber writing prescriptions for the same medication in multiple patients' names, with unusual frequency, or prescriptions being picked up by someone other than the named patient. In the Wilborn case, the PDMP data would have provided the backbone of the investigative record, establishing the timeline, the volume, and the pattern of prescriptions over the 3-year period in question. Defendant: Leslie Wilborn, nurse practitioner, Gulfport and Pascagoula, Mississippi. Facility: Maxim Health Urgent Care, Gulfport and Pascagoula, Mississippi. Offense: obtaining a controlled substance by fraud, misrepresentation, or subterfuge. Obtaining Ambien, Zolpidem Schedule 4, through prescriptions written in family members' and friends' names for personal use. Scale: more than 146 prescriptions, each containing 30 dosage units of 10 milligrams, over approximately 3 years. Investigating agency: Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics. Arrest date: July 8, 2021. Booking facility: Harrison County Adult Detention Center. Status: arrested and charged. Final disposition to be verified. Case 6. Brenda Bolden and Adron Lawrence. Nearly 200 videos were found on a tablet that had been left behind at an assisted living facility. The recordings had been made over a period of months. When investigators reviewed the contents, they documented a sustained pattern of physical abuse directed at a resident by 2 employees of the facility. Both were eventually arrested, prosecuted, and convicted. This is Case 6, the case of Brenda Bolden and Adron Lawrence, Cottonwood Manor Assisted Living, Laurel, Mississippi. Cottonwood Manor Assisted Living was located on Old Amy Road in Laurel, Mississippi, in Jones County. Laurel is located in the Pine Belt region of the state and is the county seat of Jones County. The facility operated as an assisted living provider, offering residential care to elderly adults who require assistance with daily activities but do not need the full clinical services of a skilled nursing facility. Assisted living facilities in Mississippi are licensed and regulated by the Mississippi Department of Health. They are required to meet standards related to staffing, physical environment, nutrition, medication management, and the treatment of residents. Residents of assisted living facilities are, by definition, individuals who require support with some or all of the activities of daily living: bathing, dressing, eating, mobility, and medication management. They depend on the staff of the facility for a level of care that directly affects their safety and quality of life. Brenda Bolden and Adron Lawrence were both employed at Cottonwood Manor. Bolden was 70 years old at the time of the proceedings. Lawrence was 56. Both held roles that placed them in direct contact with residents of the facility. The critical evidence in this case was not the product of a law enforcement investigation initiated on suspicion of wrongdoing. It was discovered by accident, by a new owner of the facility who found an iPad that had been left behind and, upon reviewing the contents, discovered video recordings that documented what had been occurring inside the facility. Those video recordings, captured between June and December of 2023, according to court records, numbered nearly 200. The recordings documented a sustained course of conduct involving Bolden and Lawrence in interactions with a resident of the facility. According to the description provided by Attorney General Prosecutor Brantley Walton, as reported by the Laurel Leader Call, the videos showed Bolden pushing and pulling a resident of the facility, failing to provide aid, and encouraging the behavior of another individual participating in the abuse. The conduct documented in the recordings included physical contact directed at the resident, restraint using duct tape, and verbal taunting. The recordings provided law enforcement and prosecutors with a documentary record of the conduct that is rarely available in elder abuse cases. Abuse in care facilities is frequently difficult to prove, precisely because it occurs in private spaces. The victims may be unable to report it due to cognitive or communicative limitations, and the perpetrators operate within an environment in which they have significant authority over the individuals in their care. In this case, the videos eliminated the evidentiary uncertainty that makes prosecution difficult in many elder abuse cases. Following the discovery of the videos by the new facility owner, an abuse complaint was filed. The investigation was conducted by Seth Crabtree, a former Laurel police investigator who had joined the Mississippi Attorney General's office and was working with the Vulnerable Adults Unit. The Vulnerable Adults Unit of the Mississippi Attorney General's office operates within the same institutional framework as the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit and handles cases involving the abuse, neglect, and exploitation of elderly and disabled adults in care settings. The unit has the authority to investigate and prosecute cases across the state, providing a dedicated investigative resource for crimes against vulnerable populations. Crabtree's investigation involved reviewing the video recordings, documenting the incidents captured on those recordings, and building the evidentiary record for criminal charges. The recordings themselves constituted primary evidence of the conduct alleged, footage that, according to the subsequent court proceedings, the trial judge described as incriminating. Brantley Walton of the Attorney General's office served as the lead prosecutor for both the Bolden and Lawrence cases. Both Brenda Bolden and Adron Lawrence were arrested in March of 2024. The charges brought against each defendant were for felony abuse of a vulnerable person under Mississippi law. Mississippi's statute addressing abuse of a vulnerable person provides that any person who, without justification, inflicts physical pain, injury, or mental anguish on a vulnerable adult, or who places a vulnerable adult in a situation that exposes them to a risk of physical pain or injury, may be charged with a felony. The arrest of two individuals in their 50s and 70s on felony charges for conduct occurring in an assisted living facility drew significant local attention. The Laurel Leader Call and other regional media outlets covered the arrests and the subsequent proceedings. The facility itself had, by the time of the arrests, come under new ownership, the change in ownership being the circumstance that led to the discovery of the iPad and its contents. Civil litigation was also initiated, with the facility's prior owners, Robert Hall, Andrea Hall, and Nissi Properties LLC, named as co-defendants in a related civil suit. Brenda Bolden entered a plea of guilty in July of 2024, approximately 4 months after her March arrest. The guilty plea was entered before Judge Dal Williamson in Jones County. Judge Williamson, in accepting the plea, commented on the video evidence that had formed the basis of the prosecution. He characterized the recordings as incriminating and described the conduct documented in them as despicable. Following her guilty plea, Bolden's defense stated publicly that she had lost her nursing license as a result of the proceedings and considered the loss to be permanent. The specific terms of Bolden's sentence, whether she received prison time, supervised release, or a combination, were not fully detailed in the sources reviewed for this documentary. However, the guilty plea to a felony charge for abuse of a vulnerable person carries significant sentencing exposure under Mississippi law, and the loss of her nursing license represented the permanent end of her career in the regulated healthcare workforce. Adron Lawrence was tried and convicted on 1 count of felony abuse of a vulnerable person. His sentencing was covered by the Laurel Leader Call. According to that reporting, Judge Dal Williamson sentenced Lawrence to 8 years in the custody of the Mississippi Department of Corrections on the felony abuse conviction. In addition to the custodial sentence, Lawrence received 4 years on house arrest and 3 years of post-release supervision. As part of his sentence, Lawrence was ordered not to work in the healthcare industry for a period of 10 years. That condition represented both a protective measure for future potential patients and an acknowledgement of the specific harm that arises when individuals who commit acts of abuse against vulnerable adults are allowed to return to healthcare employment. The Mississippi Department of Health, which has regulatory authority over assisted living facilities in the state, took action regarding Cottonwood Manor following the criminal proceedings. The department closed the facility on May 21, 2025. The closure of a licensed facility by the state health department represents the most severe administrative action available to the regulatory authority, a determination that the facility can no longer be permitted to operate in a manner consistent with the protection of its residents. For the residents who had lived at Cottonwood Manor, the closure required relocation to other facilities, a process that can be disorienting and distressing for elderly adults who have established routines and relationships in their residential care setting. The Cottonwood Manor case is a clear illustration of how recording technology has changed the landscape of elder abuse investigations and prosecutions. Prior to the widespread availability of consumer video devices, abuse in residential care facilities was extremely difficult to prove. The absence of independent witnesses, the potential cognitive and communicative limitations of victims, and the institutional authority of caregivers over residents created an environment in which abuse could continue for extended periods without detection. The videos recovered from the iPad in this case provided nearly 200 discrete pieces of evidence, documenting a course of conduct over a 6-month period. That evidentiary record was essentially irrefutable. It did not rely on the recollection of witnesses, the interpretation of medical findings, or the credibility determinations that juries must make when evaluating conflicting testimony. It showed directly and continuously what had occurred. As a result, the case against Bolden and Lawrence was supported by a quality of evidence that is rarely available in elder abuse prosecutions, and the outcomes, a guilty plea from Bolden and a conviction at trial for Lawrence, reflected the strength of that evidentiary record. Defendants Brenda Bolden, age 70, and Adrian Lawrence, age 56. Facility: Cottonwood Manor Assisted Living, Laurel, Mississippi. Charge: felony abuse of a vulnerable person. Evidence: approximately 200 video recordings found on a tablet, covering June through December 2023. Investigating agency: Mississippi Attorney General's Vulnerable Adults Unit. Investigator Seth Crabtree. Prosecutor Brantley Walton. Mississippi Attorney General's Office. Bolden outcome: guilty plea, July 2024. Loss of nursing license. Lawrence outcome: conviction, 8 years Mendoc, 4 years house arrest, 3 years post-release supervision. Banned from healthcare industry for 10 years. Facility outcome: closed by Mississippi Department of Health, May 21, 2025. Case 7. Tamala Monique Hammond. One night in July of 2024, an ambulance was called to a personal care facility in Pascagoula, Mississippi. The resident who needed emergency transport had not eaten adequately in an extended period and had not been receiving his prescribed medications. He was an amputee. He was also married to the facility owner's mother. By the end of that night, multiple ambulances had arrived, and the remaining residents of the facility had all been evacuated. This is Case 7. The case of Tamala Monique Hammond, owner and operator of Elegant Personal Care, Pascagoula, Mississippi. Elegant Personal Care was an adult personal care facility operating in Pascagoula, the county seat of Jackson County on Mississippi's Gulf Coast. Personal care facilities in Mississippi provide non-medical residential care to adults who require assistance with daily living activities, meal preparation, medication management, hygiene, transportation, and similar support services. These facilities are distinct from nursing homes and assisted living facilities in terms of the level of medical care they provide, but they serve a population that is nonetheless vulnerable: elderly adults, adults with disabilities, or individuals recovering from illness or injury who cannot live independently without support. Tamala Monique Hammond identified herself as a registered nurse and was both the owner and chief executive officer of Elegant Personal Care. The residents of the facility were in her care under both the regulatory framework governing personal care facilities and the ethical obligations associated with her professional identification as a healthcare practitioner. On the night of July 24, 2024, an emergency call was placed regarding a resident of Elegant Personal Care. The resident, Willie James Adams, was an amputee. He was transported by ambulance to Singing River Hospital, an acute care hospital serving the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Upon his arrival at Singing River Hospital, the clinical assessment of Adams revealed that he had not been receiving his prescribed medications and that his nutritional status was significantly compromised. He had been in the care of Elegant Personal Care, a facility operated by a person who identified as a registered nurse and held herself out as qualified to provide oversight of the residents' care and well-being. The relationship between Hammond and Adams was noted by investigators as an aggravating contextual factor. Adams was married to Hammond's mother, Rubenia. Following the emergency transport of Willie James Adams, Pascagoula authorities initiated a broader assessment of the facility and its remaining residents. What that assessment found prompted the emergency evacuation of the other residents. Multiple ambulances were dispatched to Elegant Personal Care on the night of July 24th. Each of the remaining residents, individuals who had been entrusted to the care of Hammond's facility, was removed and transported for medical evaluation. The city of Pascagoula conducted an inspection of the physical facility and found conditions that supported condemnation. According to reporting by Locks, the city condemned the building, citing unsanitary conditions, exposed electrical equipment, and the presence of insects. The combination of the medical condition of the residents and the physical state of the facility presented investigators and prosecutors with a documented picture of systemic failure in the duty of care owed to the individuals living at Elegant Personal Care. Tamala Monique Hammond was arrested on July 25, 2024, the day following the emergency response, by the Pascagoula Police Department. The charges brought against her numbered 7 felony counts, with 1 count corresponding to each of the 7 senior residents who had been in her care. The charges included exploitation of a vulnerable person, inflicting severe mental anguish on a vulnerable adult, and willfully inflicting pain on a vulnerable adult. The charge of exploitation of a vulnerable person addresses the financial dimension of elder care abuse, specifically, the use of a caregiver relationship to obtain financial benefit or resources at the expense of the vulnerable adult. In the context of a personal care facility, this charge can reflect the receipt of payment from residents, their families, or Medicaid for care that was not actually provided or that fell far short of the standard required. The charges for inflicting severe mental anguish and willfully inflicting pain address the direct harm to the residents themselves. Following her initial arrest and the posting of bond, Hammond was released from custody. However, she was subsequently rearrested for alleged violation of the conditions of her bond, specifically a no-contact order that had been imposed as a condition of her release. The violation of the no-contact order resulted in the revocation of her bond, and Hammond was returned to custody without the option of release, pending the resolution of her criminal case. Bond revocation in cases involving vulnerable adult exploitation is a tool used by courts to protect potential witnesses and victims from further contact with or pressure from the defendant. The issuance of the original no-contact order reflected the court's assessment that such protection was warranted in this case. The condemnation of the Elegant Personal Care Facility by the City of Pascagoula represented an immediate regulatory action triggered by the physical conditions found at the building. Building condemnation is typically a municipal action addressed through the city's code enforcement authority, and it reflects a determination that the structure is unfit for occupancy under the applicable health, safety, and building codes. In addition to the municipal condemnation, the Mississippi State Department of Health has authority over the licensure and operation of personal care facilities in Mississippi. A facility operating under conditions documented at Elegant Personal Care, residents with inadequate nutrition, missed medications, and a condemned physical plant, would be subject to license revocation proceedings by the State Health Department. The combination of criminal charges against the operator, municipal condemnation of the facility, and potential state licensing action represents the full spectrum of accountability mechanisms available in cases involving personal care facility operators who fail to meet their obligations to the residents in their care. Mississippi statutes protecting vulnerable adults provide the legal framework under which the 7 felony charges against Hammond were brought. A vulnerable adult, as defined under Mississippi law, includes any person aged 60 or older, as well as any person with a physical or mental disability who is unable to adequately protect themselves from exploitation, neglect, or abuse. The statutes provide for felony-level prosecution in cases involving exploitation, abuse, and the infliction of pain or mental anguish on vulnerable adults. The 7-count indictment against Hammond, 1 count per resident, reflected the prosecution's application of these statutes to each individual affected by the alleged conduct at the facility. Defendant, Tamala Monique Hammond, owner and operator, identified as RN. Facility, Elegant Personal Care, Pascagoula, Mississippi. Charges, 7 felony counts. Exploitation of a vulnerable person, inflicting severe mental anguish on a vulnerable adult, and willfully inflicting pain on a vulnerable adult. Arrest date, July 25, 2024. Arresting agency, Pascagoula Police Department. Facility status, condemned by City of Pascagoula. Post-arrest, rearrested for violation of no-contact order, bond revoked. Status, criminal case pending, as of available records, final disposition to be verified. Case 8, Carolyn Davis and Rolanda Russell. 2 separate cases, 2 different facilities in Mississippi, 2 different types of crimes, but the same essential breach. Individuals entrusted with the care of people who could not protect themselves chose to harm them instead, one through direct physical abuse, the other through financial exploitation. This is Case 8. The cases of Carolyn Davis and Rolanda Russell, healthcare workers in Mississippi. Carolyn Davis was 48 years old and lived in Mount Olive, Mississippi, in Covington County. She was employed as a caregiver at a Mississippi care facility that housed individuals with mental disabilities. Her role placed her in direct contact with the residents of that facility, including individuals whose cognitive and communicative limitations made them particularly dependent on the caregiving staff. The charge brought against Davis was felony abuse of a vulnerable adult. The conduct alleged in the indictment was that she had repeatedly struck a mentally handicapped child resident on the head with a hairbrush. Under Mississippi's vulnerable adult statutes, individuals who are residents of care facilities and who have mental disabilities are afforded protection regardless of their age. The statute covers both adults and, in certain contexts, minors who are served by adult care systems. The use of physical force against a vulnerable individual in a care facility context constitutes abuse under the statute and carries felony-level penalties. Davis was indicted by a grand jury and arrested on the abuse charge. The investigation was reported by Well BT, one of the Jackson area television news stations that covers criminal proceedings across central Mississippi. The case against Davis followed the standard investigative process for caregiver abuse in institutional settings, a process that typically involves an initial complaint or report, a review of facility records and staff logs, interviews with staff and any witnesses, and the collection of any available documentary or physical evidence. The nature of the conduct alleged against Davis, repeated physical contact directed at a vulnerable resident, raised questions about whether facility oversight had been adequate and whether the abuse had been occurring for an extended period without detection. Rolanda Russell was 38 years old and lived in Braxton, Mississippi, in Simpson County. She was employed as a caregiver at a nursing home in Mississippi. The charge brought against Russell was financial in nature, rather than involving direct physical harm. According to the reporting by Well BT, Russell was arrested for stealing more than $2,000 from a nursing home resident in her care. Financial exploitation of nursing home residents is a documented and persistent problem in long-term care settings nationwide. Residents of nursing homes frequently have limited ability to monitor their own financial accounts, manage their cash, or independently identify unauthorized transactions. Some residents may have cognitive impairments such as dementia that further limit their capacity to recognize when financial harm is occurring. Caregivers in nursing home settings often have access to residents' personal belongings, including wallets, purses, and cash. In some facilities, staff assist residents with personal transactions. That access, combined with the cognitive vulnerability of the resident population, creates an environment in which financial exploitation can occur with relative ease. The charge against Russell reflected the application of Mississippi's criminal statutes governing theft and potentially the exploitation of a vulnerable adult to her alleged conduct in stealing from a resident entrusted to her care. The pairing of the Davis and Russell cases in this documentary is deliberate. They represent the two most common categories of caregiver-committed crime in Mississippi's residential care facilities: physical abuse and financial exploitation, and they illustrate how both categories share a common root: the exploitation of the power differential that exists between a caregiver and a vulnerable adult in an institutional setting. In both cases, the victims were individuals with limited capacity to advocate for themselves. In both cases, the defendants were employed in roles specifically designed to support and protect those individuals. And in both cases, the criminal charges that were ultimately brought represent the legal system's response to the fundamental violation of the duty of care that the caregiver-patient relationship imposes. The investigations into both Davis and Russell followed established pathways: the receipt of a complaint, the investigative review, the grand jury process, and the arrest. The cases were prosecuted through the relevant circuit court systems, with oversight from the Mississippi Attorney General's office in cases involving Medicaid-certified facilities. Carolyn Davis and Rolanda Russell are identified in the available sources as caregivers rather than licensed nurses. This distinction is important to the documentary record. Not all individuals working in Mississippi care facilities hold nursing licenses. Facilities also employ certified nursing assistants, personal care aides, and other direct care workers who may or may not hold state certifications. Mississippi's caregiving and direct care workforce is regulated at varying levels. Certified nursing assistants are required to complete state-approved training and pass a competency evaluation before working in Medicaid-certified facilities. Their certification can be revoked based on substantiated findings of abuse, neglect, or misappropriation of property through the Mississippi Nurse Aid Registry. The Mississippi Nurse Aid Registry is a state-maintained database that records findings of abuse, neglect, or misappropriation against certified nursing aides in Mississippi. A substantiated finding results in the individual being listed on the registry with a notation that they have been found to have committed abuse, neglect, or misappropriation, a designation that effectively bars them from employment in any Medicaid-certified facility. Both the Davis and Russell cases came to light through the standard reporting mechanisms available in Mississippi's Care Facility Oversight System. Those mechanisms include mandatory reporting requirements for facility staff and administrators who observe or have reason to suspect abuse or exploitation, the Adult Protective Services System administered by the Mississippi Department of Human Services, which receives reports and conducts investigations, and the Attorney General's Vulnerable Adults Unit, which has investigative and prosecutorial authority in cases of abuse and exploitation in care settings. The challenge in both categories of conduct, physical abuse and financial exploitation, is that the primary victims are often unable to report the harm themselves. In the Davis case, the victim was a mentally handicapped child in a care facility. In the Russell case, the victim was a nursing home resident whose financial assets were accessible to someone with physical proximity to them in the facility. The detection and prosecution of these crimes depends heavily on the vigilance of coworkers, the attentiveness of family members who visit, the robustness of the facility's internal oversight systems, and the effectiveness of the state reporting and investigative infrastructure. Defendant 1. Carolyn Davis, age 48, Mount Olive, Mississippi. Facility: Mississippi Care Facility housing individuals with mental disabilities. Charge: felony abuse of a vulnerable adult. Alleged conduct: repeated physical contact directed at a mentally handicapped child resident. Status: indicted and arrested. Defendant 2, Rolanda Russell, age 38, Braxton, Mississippi. Facility: Mississippi Nursing Home. Charge: theft, exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Alleged conduct: stealing more than $2,000 from a nursing home resident. Status: arrested. Both cases reported by Well BT, Jackson, Mississippi. Case 9, Regina Thomas. Between January of 2015 and December of 2019, a licensed practical nurse running a healthcare network in Jackson, Mississippi, submitted Medicaid claims for services that were not provided to patients. Over 5 years, the fraudulent billing totaled more than $4 million. When investigators from the Mississippi Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit completed their review, the full scope of the fraud was documented in detail. This is Case 9. The case of Regina Thomas, licensed practical nurse, Total Healthcare Network, Jackson, Mississippi. Regina Thomas was a licensed practical nurse based in Bolton, Mississippi in Hinds County. She held an LPN license issued by the Mississippi Board of Nursing and operated Total Healthcare Network in Jackson, the state capital. Total Healthcare Network was a healthcare service provider that participated in Mississippi's Medicaid program. Participation in Medicaid allows healthcare providers to submit claims to the state for reimbursement of services provided to Medicaid-eligible patients. The Medicaid program in Mississippi, as in all states, operates under both federal and state oversight, with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services at the federal level and the Mississippi Division of Medicaid at the state level. When a healthcare provider enrolls in Medicaid and submits claims for reimbursement, they enter into a legal and contractual commitment to submit only accurate claims for services that were actually provided to eligible patients. The submission of claims for services that were not rendered, or the submission of claims at rates that do not accurately reflect the services provided, constitutes Medicaid fraud, a crime under both federal and Mississippi law. As the operator of Total Healthcare Network, Thomas held direct authority and responsibility over the claims submitted by her organization. The fraudulent billing scheme attributed to Regina Thomas ran from January of 2015 through December of 2019, a 5-year period during which the operation of Total Healthcare Network generated more than $4 million in fraudulent Medicaid reimbursements. The specific methods of the fraud, whether through billing for services entirely not rendered, upcoding services to higher reimbursement levels, billing for patient encounters that did not occur, or other billing manipulations, are consistent with the patterns documented in healthcare fraud prosecutions nationally. The Medicaid Fraud Control Unit's investigation involved the analysis of years of billing data from Total Healthcare Network, cross-referenced with patient records, staff records, and other documentation relevant to establishing what services were actually provided versus what was billed. Healthcare billing fraud investigations of this type are data-intensive. The MFCU employs healthcare auditors alongside criminal investigators, and the review of 5 years of billing records requires the systematic comparison of claim submissions with supporting documentation for each claim. The scale of the fraud, $4,091,208.09, as stated precisely in the restitution order, reflected the sustained nature of the scheme over a multi-year period and the significant financial harm to Mississippi's Medicaid program. The Mississippi Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit was the investigative body that developed the case against Regina Thomas. Under the direction of Attorney General Lynn Fitch, who took office in January of 2020, the unit continued the investigation that had been initiated and was building during the period of Thomas's alleged fraudulent activity. The MFCU's investigative process in billing fraud cases typically involves data analytics as the first stage, the identification of statistical anomalies in billing patterns that suggest fraud. Once anomalies are identified, investigators pull the underlying documentation to determine whether the claims were legitimate or fraudulent. In the Thomas case, the 5-year time frame and the magnitude of the alleged fraud, exceeding $4 million, indicate that the fraudulent billing had been sustained at a consistent rate over the full period, rather than representing a brief episode or an isolated cluster of false claims. Following the completion of the investigation, the case was presented for prosecution. Regina Thomas pleaded guilty to the charges against her. The guilty plea resolved the criminal case without proceeding to trial, and the plea was entered before the sentencing court. The case was prosecuted by the Mississippi Attorney General's Office under Attorney General Lynn Fitch. The prosecution of healthcare fraud cases by the MFCU represents both a financial recovery function, seeking restitution of the fraudulently obtained Medicaid funds, and a public accountability function, ensuring that healthcare providers who exploit the Medicaid program face criminal consequences. The guilty plea in the Thomas case acknowledged the full scope of the fraudulent billing scheme, including the 5-year time frame and the total amount fraudulently obtained from Medicaid. On August 17th, in the year reported by WellBT as 2021, Regina Thomas was sentenced in the relevant Mississippi court. The sentence imposed included 5 years in prison and 5 years of post-release supervision. The 5-year custodial term reflected both the severity of the fraud and the sustained, deliberate nature of the conduct over a 5-year period. In addition to the custodial sentence, Thomas was ordered to pay full restitution of $4,091,208.09, the precise amount identified by investigators as having been fraudulently obtained from the Medicaid program. The restitution order represented an attempt to restore to the Medicaid program the funds that had been diverted through fraudulent billing. Medicaid funding, it should be noted, supports healthcare services for low-income individuals, the elderly, and people with disabilities across Mississippi. Fraud against Medicaid is, in practical effect, a theft of resources that would otherwise have supported legitimate healthcare services for vulnerable populations. Attorney General Lynn Fitch, in announcing the sentence, framed the prosecution within the broader mission of protecting Mississippi's Medicaid program and the patients it serves. The Thomas case presents an intersection of professional licensing, business operation, and criminal conduct that is worth examining in its own right. Thomas held an LPN license, a credential that authorizes clinical practice under physician and RN supervision, but does not typically authorize the autonomous operation of a multi-year healthcare services company. The question of what clinical services a healthcare network operated by an LPN can legitimately provide, and how those services should be billed to Medicaid, is governed by both Mississippi Board of Nursing Scope of Practice regulations and Mississippi Division of Medicaid Provider Enrollment Standards. The investigation by the MFCU would have included a review of both the billing practices and the underlying services claimed to have been provided, assessing whether the services billed were within the scope of practice of an LPN-operated entity and whether the patients named in the claims had actually received those services. The combination of a criminal conviction for Medicaid fraud and the specific findings of the MFCU investigation would typically result in Thomas's enrollment as a Medicaid provider being terminated and her LPN license being referred to the Mississippi Board of Nursing for disciplinary review. The Thomas case, at more than $4 million over 5 years, represents a significant individual fraud case, but it is part of a broader national and statewide pattern of Medicaid fraud that costs healthcare programs tens of billions of dollars annually. The federal government, through the Office of Inspector General of the Department of Health and Human Services, publishes annual reports on Medicaid fraud enforcement activities, and Mississippi's MFCU results are included in those reports. Mississippi, like other states with significant Medicaid populations, faces ongoing challenges in ensuring the integrity of its Medicaid billing systems. The tools available for detecting fraud have improved substantially over time. Data analytics platforms now allow investigators to identify billing anomalies in near real time, rather than relying on after-the-fact audits that may allow fraud to continue for years before detection. The Thomas case, with its 5-year duration, may be an example of a fraud that extended over a longer period than would be expected with more modern analytical detection tools in place. The development and deployment of those tools represents an ongoing investment in the integrity of the Medicaid program. Defendant, Regina Thomas. Licensed practical nurse, Bolton, Mississippi. Organization, Total Healthcare Network, Jackson, Mississippi. Offense, Medicaid fraud, billing for services not rendered to patients. Duration, January 2015 through December 2019. Amount, $4,091,208.09. Investigating Agency, Mississippi Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. Plea, guilty. Sentence, 5 years in prison, 5 years post-release supervision, full restitution. Sentencing announced, August 18, 2021. WLBT, citing A.G. Lynn Fitch. Case 10. Susan K. Perry. A nurse practitioner with prescribing authority wrote prescriptions for compounded medications. Lots of them. Prescriptions for patients she had sometimes never examined. Prescriptions written with the full knowledge that a specific pharmacy would submit the bills to federal healthcare programs. Programs that paid out more than $1,375,000 based on her prescriptions alone. Federal investigators from multiple agencies spent months building the case before a 13-count indictment was returned. This is Case 10. The case of Susan K. Perry, nurse practitioner, Southern Mississippi. The case against Susan K. Perry arose from a broader federal investigation into Advantage Pharmacy, a compounding pharmacy located in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Understanding the context of compounding pharmacy fraud is essential to understanding Perry's role in the scheme. Compounding pharmacies prepare customized medications, formulations that are not commercially available as standard manufactured drugs. Compounded medications can serve legitimate medical purposes, such as preparing medications in a different dosage form for patients who cannot swallow tablets, or formulating medications in strengths not available commercially. However, compounding pharmacies became the focus of significant federal fraud enforcement beginning in the early 2010s, when investigators identified a pattern in which certain compounding pharmacies were paying kickbacks to prescribers, including physicians and nurse practitioners, in exchange for the writing of prescriptions for compounded medications that would be billed to federal healthcare programs at inflated rates. The programs being billed, including TRICARE, the federal healthcare program serving military members and their families, were paying significantly higher reimbursement rates for certain compounded medications than for commercially available equivalents. The scheme was straightforward in concept. Prescribers write prescriptions for compounded medications for patients who do not need them, or without examining those patients, and the pharmacy bills the federal program at the inflated compounded medication rate, generating revenue that is then shared with the prescribers as kickbacks. Susan K. Perry was 58 years old and described in the court documents as residing in Grand Bay, Alabama, a community near the Mississippi state line in Mobile County. Her criminal case was prosecuted in the Southern District of Mississippi, reflecting the location of Advantage Pharmacy in Hattiesburg and the jurisdiction of her prescribing conduct in Mississippi. Perry held a license as a nurse practitioner with prescribing authority. As a nurse practitioner, she had the authority to write prescriptions for medications, including compounded medications, and those prescriptions could be billed to federal healthcare programs through the pharmacy that filled them. Her participation in the Advantage Pharmacy scheme, as documented in the federal indictment, involved the writing of prescriptions for compounded medications for individuals who did not need them, and in some cases for individuals she had not examined at all, meaning no clinical assessment had been conducted to establish that the prescribed medication was medically necessary. The investigation into the Advantage Pharmacy scheme involved multiple federal agencies, reflecting the complexity of healthcare fraud cases that span both clinical conduct and financial crimes. The Federal Bureau of Investigation conducted criminal investigation of the fraud and conspiracy elements of the scheme. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, IRSCI, investigated the financial dimensions, including the flow of money between the pharmacy and the prescribers, and the tax implications of unreported income from kickback payments. The Defense Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS, investigated because TRICARE, as a federal defense healthcare program, was among the programs being defrauded. The Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics was also involved, likely in connection with the regulatory and controlled substance aspects of the compounded medication prescriptions. The coordination of 4 agencies in a single healthcare fraud investigation reflects the multidimensional nature of the conduct: a criminal conspiracy involving prescribers, a pharmacy, federal program billing, and financial transactions that crossed multiple regulatory boundaries. Perry was charged in a 13-count federal indictment, returned in October of 2017. The 13-count indictment represented the government's comprehensive charging approach, addressing the multiple dimensions and instances of the alleged criminal conduct over the period from approximately January 2014 through April 2015. From approximately January of 2014 through April of 2015, a period of approximately 16 months, federal healthcare programs reimbursed Advantage Pharmacy approximately $1,375,692 based on the prescriptions written by Susan K. Perry. That figure represents the total billed and paid on prescriptions bearing her name as the prescribing provider. The amount is significant both in absolute terms and in terms of what it reflects about the scale of the prescription writing activity during the 16-month period. For TRICARE, the primary federal program targeted in the Advantage Pharmacy scheme, the harm was direct: funds drawn from the federal defense healthcare budget based on fraudulent prescriptions for medications that patients did not need and were not prescribed on the basis of legitimate clinical judgment. Rather than proceeding to trial on all 13 counts of the federal indictment, Susan K. Perry pleaded guilty to a single count of conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud. The plea was entered on June 15th. The conspiracy count to which she pleaded guilty acknowledged her knowing participation in the Advantage Pharmacy scheme, the agreement with others to submit fraudulent claims to federal healthcare programs through the mechanism of her prescriptions. A conspiracy charge in federal court requires the government to prove that the defendant knowingly agreed with at least one other person to achieve an unlawful objective and that at least one overt act was taken in furtherance of that conspiracy. Perry's guilty plea acknowledged all elements of that charge. Susan K. Perry was sentenced by United States District Judge Keith Starrett in the Southern District of Mississippi. Judge Starrett imposed a sentence of 42 months, 3.5 years, in federal prison. In addition to the custodial sentence, Judge Starrett ordered 3 years of supervised release following Perry's release from prison. He also ordered full restitution in the amount of $1,375,692. The total amount that federal programs had paid based on her fraudulent prescriptions. Judge Starrett's remarks at sentencing were recorded. He addressed Perry directly, stating, "This is not an innocent mistake. This was an intentional act." That statement, direct, unambiguous, and entered into the record of a federal sentencing proceeding, captured the judicial assessment of Perry's conduct with precision. The framing rejected any suggestion that the writing of prescriptions for patients not examined and not in need of the medications could be characterized as an error in clinical judgment or an administrative oversight. The court characterized it, on the record, as an intentional act. A federal conviction for conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud carries automatic and significant consequences for a nurse practitioner's federal prescribing credentials. Perry's DEA registration number, the federal credential that authorized her to prescribe controlled substances, would have been subject to revocation proceedings following the conviction. Additionally, the conviction triggered review by the relevant state nursing licensing board. Nurse practitioners convicted of federal felonies related to their professional practice face license revocation proceedings under the applicable State Nursing Practice Act. The combination of the federal prison sentence, the supervised release period, the restitution obligation, the DEA registration consequences, and the state nursing license consequences represents a comprehensive accountability outcome from both the criminal and regulatory systems. The Advantage Pharmacy case in Hattiesburg was part of a nationally documented pattern of TRICARE fraud involving compounding pharmacies. Between approximately 2012 and 2017, federal investigators across multiple states identified schemes in which compounding pharmacies paid kickbacks to prescribers, both physicians and nurse practitioners, in exchange for high-volume compounded medication prescriptions billed to TRICARE. The Department of Defense Inspector General and the Department of Justice prosecuted numerous cases nationally arising from these schemes. The Advantage Pharmacy case in Hattiesburg represented the Mississippi instance of this pattern, with multiple defendants, including pharmacy personnel and prescribers, charged in connection with the operation. The Perry case, as one component of the broader Advantage Pharmacy investigation, illustrates how healthcare fraud at the prescriber level connects to a larger fraudulent operation, and how multi-agency investigations are able to map the full structure of a fraud scheme by following the financial flows from prescriber to pharmacy to federal program reimbursement. Defendant Susan K. Perry, age 58, nurse practitioner, Grand Bay, Alabama, Southern Mississippi. Of scheme: conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, Advantage Pharmacy, Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Duration of relevant conduct: approximately January 2014 through April 2015. Federal programs defrauded: TRICARE and others. Total reimbursement on her prescriptions: $1,375,692. Federal indictment: October 2017. 13 counts. Plea: guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud. June 15th. Sentencing judge, United States District Judge Keith Starrett, Southern District of Mississippi. Sentence: 42 months federal prison, 3 years supervised release, $1,375,692 restitution. Investigating agencies: FBI, DCIS, Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics.